When I was renovating my old house, I found a check for $52 million under the mattress and a note with my name on it. I had never seen that kind of money in my life. When I learned the truth, my whole life turned upside down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Caroline Marsh, and for most of my life, I believed I was an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, which is exactly what someone wanted me to believe. I was 43 years old when everything changed. I lived in a modest ranch house in Clarksville, Tennessee, where I'd spent the better part of 2 decades raising my daughter Lily, working as a licensed paralegal at a mid-size firm, and being a dutiful wife to my husband, Daniel Marsh. We had met in our mid-20s, married quickly, and settled into the kind of life that looks perfectly fine from the outside. Date nights every other Friday, a joint checking account, a golden retriever named Scout. Comfortable, predictable, safe. Or so I thought. I had inherited the old house on Birchwood Lane from my grandmother, Dorothy Elaine Pruitt, who passed away in the spring 2 years before all of this happened. Grandma Dorothy was a quiet woman who kept to herself in her final years, living alone in that creaking 4-bedroom farmhouse after my grandfather Earl died. She left it to me, not to my mother, not to any of her 3 sons, but specifically to me, her granddaughter, by name in her will. At the time, I thought it was sentiment. She always said I reminded her of herself. I didn't think there was anything more to it than that. Daniel wanted to sell the house immediately. He said the property taxes were a drain, that the foundation needed work, that we didn't need the headache. He brought it up at dinner, calmly, logically, with the kind of rehearsed reasonableness that I had learned to recognize over the years as his way of pre-closing a conversation. But something in me resisted. Something quiet and stubborn rose up and said, "Not yet." So I decided to renovate it instead. I told myself it was about preserving family history. Maybe I'd rent it out. Maybe Lily could live there after college. Daniel didn't argue further, which I told myself was him being supportive. I know now it was something else entirely. I started the renovation in early March. I hired a small local crew for the structural work, but I handled the interior myself on weekends, stripping wallpaper, pulling up old carpet, cataloging what furniture was worth keeping. It was during the 3rd weekend on a gray Saturday morning that I moved to Grandma Dorothy's bedroom. The room smelled like cedar and old talcum powder. Her iron bed frame was still there, the mattress untouched. I had been avoiding this room, I realized. It felt the most like her. I put on her old radio station. She always kept an AM station tuned to gospel music, and began pulling the furniture away from the walls. When I lifted the mattress to drag it toward the door, something slid and thumped against the wooden slats of the bed frame. I thought it was a book, maybe a Bible. Grandma Dorothy used to tuck things between the mattress and the box spring. Tissues, prayer cards, photographs, but this was heavier than a book. I set the mattress against the wall and looked down. There was a large manila envelope sealed with 3 strips of packing tape, old and yellowed at the edges. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. Not Caroline, not Carrie, but my full legal name, Caroline Elaine Pruitt Marsh. The sight of it made my throat tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Inside the envelope were 2 things, a handwritten letter and a cashier's check made out in my name. The check was from First Southern Trust Bank. The amount, printed in crisp, dark ink, was $52 million. $52 million. I sat down on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom on the cold, bare wood with a check worth more than I could comprehend in my hands, and I read her letter. She told me she had been keeping something safe. She told me it had always been meant for me. She told me that there were people I trusted, who had known about this money and had been trying to ensure I never found it. People I trusted. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I was completely still, sitting on that floor with the radio playing softly and tenderly in the background, and I was thinking, how long? How many years had someone been watching me, steering me, keeping me away from a room in a house that was always supposed to be mine? I folded the letter carefully. I put it back in the envelope. I looked at the check for a long moment. Then I put everything back exactly where I had found it, replaced the mattress, and walked out to my car. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I drove home, and I said nothing to Daniel. The drive home from Birchwood Lane that afternoon took 40 minutes, and I did not turn on the radio. I needed the silence. I needed to hear myself think, because the thoughts that were moving through my mind were not the kind I had ever entertained before. They were sharp-edged and cold, and they demanded careful handling. By the time I pulled into our driveway on Sycamore Drive, I had already begun to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. $52 million does not materialize from nowhere. A woman like my grandmother, a farmer's wife who clipped coupons and reused aluminum foil, does not accumulate that kind of wealth in secret without a reason. And a woman like her does not hide it under a mattress and write a warning letter without knowing with some precision who the threat was. People I trusted. She had used the plural. I went inside and made dinner as though nothing had happened. Pasta with jarred marinara, garlic bread from the freezer. Daniel was in the living room watching the game. He called out that he was hungry. I called back that it would be 20 minutes. I set the table. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard while the water boiled, running through names the way you run through a grocery list. Daniel, his sister, Renata Marsh, who had never liked me but wore her dislike with the smooth finish of politeness. Their mother, Gloria, who'd been pushing for years, quietly, persistently, for us to sell that house. And then there was my own mother's older brother, my Uncle Harlan, who had contested Grandma Dorothy's will when she left the property to me rather than to her own children. The lawsuit went nowhere, but he had never stopped talking about it as though he'd been wronged. I thought about the timing. Daniel had pushed to sell the house within weeks of Dorothy's death, before I had even finished grieving her. The property taxes are a drain, Caroline. You're being sentimental. Let it go. How many times had he said some version of that? How many casual, reasonable-sounding arguments had he constructed to keep me away from that house? And then I thought about something worse. The one time I had mentioned to Daniel, offhandedly, that I was going to sort through Dorothy's bedroom furniture. The one time I had said that specifically. He had suggested, very naturally, that we hire an estate sale company to handle everything. They'll take care of it all. We don't have to lift a finger. I had agreed, and then I'd forgotten, and the estate sale company was never called. By whom? I ate dinner. I listened to Daniel talk about his week. I laughed at the right moments. I asked about his meeting on Thursday. And behind my eyes, very quietly, I was doing something I had never done in 20 years of marriage. I was building a case. The fear arrived that night at around 2 a.m. I lay in the dark and felt it move through me like cold water. The fear of being wrong, the fear of being right, the fear of what either outcome would cost me. If I was wrong, I would be the paranoid wife who found money and lost her mind. If I was right, I was married to a man who had spent years ensuring I never found what was mine. But fear, I have learned, is not the opposite of action. Sometimes fear is the thing that clarifies. By 3 a.m, the fear had burned down to something harder and cleaner: resolve. I could not go to Daniel. I could not go to my mother, who had always been close to Harlan. I could not use our joint accounts, our shared email server, our home computer. I could not make a single move that could be observed, interpreted, and countered before I was ready. The first thing I needed was information. I worked as a paralegal. I understood legal documents, estate law, financial instruments. I understood that a cashier's check of that size could be verified, traced, and, if legitimate, deposited, but that doing so without legal preparation would expose me immediately. I also understood that if someone had known about that check for 2 years and had not made a move to steal it outright, they were playing a longer game, which meant I had some time. Not much, but some. The next morning, a Sunday, I told Daniel I was going back to the house to work on the kitchen tile. He nodded without looking up from his phone. I drove to Birchwood Lane, retrieved the envelope, photographed every line of my grandmother's letter with my personal cell phone, then returned everything to its exact position under the mattress. On Monday, I used my lunch break to open a private checking account at a bank across town. Not the First Southern Trust where the check was drawn, and not the bank where Daniel and I had our joint accounts. I used only my maiden name, Caroline Pruitt. I funded it with $400 in cash from money I had been quietly setting aside from my paycheck over the past year. Money I had saved for no reason I could have named at the time, except that some part of me, some animal instinct I hadn't listened to consciously, had been preparing. On Tuesday, I called a colleague, a woman named Patricia Solano, who had left our firm 2 years ago to open her own estate and probate practice. We'd always respected each other. I did not tell her everything. I told her I had found documents in my late grandmother's home that I needed to have reviewed privately and confidentially, and that I was not yet ready to involve other family members. She said, "Come in Thursday, don't bring anything with you except your ID, we'll talk first." That was my first real step, and stepping onto that path, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, the sensation of moving forward under my own power towards something I had chosen on ground that belonged to me alone. Patricia Solano's office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian on Maple Street, 12 blocks from the firm where I worked. I had walked past it a dozen times without thinking twice. On Thursday morning, I walked in through the front door and felt my heartbeat in my fingertips. Patricia was a small, precise woman with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head like a headband. She had a quality I have always admired and rarely encountered. She listened without interrupting and without performing sympathy. She simply took in information and processed it. When I finished explaining what I had found, the check, the letter, the hiding place, my suspicions about Daniel and about Harlan, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has anyone else handled the envelope since you found it?" "No," I said. "I was alone." "Good. That matters." She folded her hands on the desk. "Here's what I need you to understand. If the check is legitimate, if it was issued by First Southern Trust and backed by real funds, then it belongs to you the moment it's verified and deposited in your name. It doesn't matter who knew about it, who hid it from you, or what anyone else wanted. The money is yours. And if someone tries to contest it, then we fight that in court. But first we verify." She paused. I'm going to recommend we bring in a financial investigator I trust, a woman named Sandra Cho. She's a forensic accountant. She can trace the origin of those funds without triggering any immediate flags at the bank. Before we take a single legal step, we need to know what we're dealing with. I agreed. Patricia's assistant drew up a confidentiality agreement, standard but airtight, and I signed it. For the first time since Saturday morning, I felt the ground solidify beneath me. What I did not know as I walked back to my car was that I was already being watched. 3 days later, on Sunday evening, Daniel came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes and said casually that he had run into his sister Renata at the grocery store. She mentioned she drove past the Birchwood house, he said, drying a pan that didn't need drying. Said she saw your car there during the week. I kept my hands in the dishwater. I go on weekdays sometimes, I said. It's easier to work without the crew around. He put the pan away. She also said Harlan called her. I turned off the faucet. About what? I don't know exactly. He didn't look at me. Something about the estate not being fully settled. She said he's been talking to someone. A lawyer, maybe. I dried my hands on the dish towel and said, "That sounds like Harlan." And I smiled the way I had been trained by 20 years of marriage to smile. Easy, untroubled, faintly amused. Inside, my mind was moving very fast. They knew something was in motion. They didn't know what. But the fact that Harlan had contacted a lawyer so soon after I had visited the house, before I had taken a single visible legal step, told me something important. Someone had been monitoring that house. Someone had a way of knowing when I was there, and how long, and perhaps what I was doing inside. I called Sandra Cho the following Monday and told her to expedite the trace. Her report came back within the week, and it destroyed any remaining doubt I had. The $52 million had originated from a trust established in 1987 by my grandfather, Earl Pruitt, 3 years before his death. The trust had been structured specifically for a single beneficiary, his granddaughter, Caroline Elaine Pruitt, to be accessed upon her inheritance of the Birchwood Lane property. It was a legal instrument, properly filed, registered with the state of Tennessee. The money had been sitting in an escrow-style account at First Southern Trust for over 30 years. But Sandra had found something else. Someone had made 3 separate inquiries to First Southern Trust over the past 2 years, since Dorothy's death, attempting to initiate a redirect of the funds. The inquiries had been blocked each time because the trust instrument required the original cashier's check and the in-person signature of Caroline Elaine Pruitt Marsh. The name on those redirect inquiries? Harlan Pruitt, my mother's brother, my grandmother's son. And the attorney of record on all 3 inquiries? A man named Jeffrey Crane, who was, I discovered within 24 hours of Sandra's report, the same attorney that Daniel had used to draw up a business incorporation 2 years ago, a fact buried in paperwork I had signed without reading because Daniel told me it was routine. I sat in Patricia's office with that report in my hands and understood completely and without any remaining ambiguity what had been happening. Harlan wanted the money. Daniel knew about it, had likely known for years, perhaps before we were even married, and together, in whatever arrangement they had made, they had been working to keep me away from a house that held the key to everything, waiting for me to give up, sell it, or simply never look under the mattress. "How solid is this?" I asked Patricia. She looked at me over her reading glasses. Solid enough to act. The plan Patricia and I had built was quiet and sequential, like closing doors one at a time in a burning house, or rather, in a house that others thought they owned. Step 1. Verify and secure the check under protective legal custody, using Patricia as the agent of record so that no individual could claim I had acted unilaterally. Step 2. File a motion with the probate court to formally confirm my status as sole beneficiary of Earl Pruitt's trust, creating a public legal record that could not be quietly redirected. Step 3. Initiate the deposit process at First Southern Trust in coordination with their estate department, with Patricia present. We moved through steps 1 and 2 in the same week. The probate filing was a matter of public record, which meant that within 48 hours of filing, anyone paying attention, anyone with an alert set on my name or on that estate, would know. They found out on a Wednesday. I was at work when my phone rang with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Jeffrey Crane, identifying himself as an attorney representing Harlan Pruitt in the matter of the Earl Pruitt estate, informing me that his client believed the trust document had been improperly interpreted and that he intended to file a competing claim. His voice was practiced and smooth, the voice of a man accustomed to making threats sound like courtesy. 3 hours later, Daniel called me at my desk. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm at work," I said. "Tonight, then." I drove home that evening with a deliberate steadiness, the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having accepted it so fully it can no longer surprise you. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, not on the couch, not in his usual chair. The table. He had positioned himself like this was a negotiation. "I know you went to see a lawyer," he said. "I went to see a lawyer," I confirmed, setting my bag on the counter. "Caroline." His voice shifted into something I recognized, the soft, slightly injured tone he used when he wanted me to feel that I was causing a problem rather than responding to one. "Whatever you think is going on, whatever Harlan may have done in the past, this doesn't have to become a war. You could have talked to me." "About what?" I said. "About the $52 million that's been sitting in my grandfather's trust for 30 years? Or about the fact that you used the same attorney as Harlan to try to redirect those funds?" The color left his face. That was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that he had not expected me to know about Jeffrey Crane. He had believed until that second that what I knew was incomplete, that I was operating on suspicion rather than documentation. He recovered quickly. That was always his talent. "You don't understand how complicated this is," he said. "Then explain it to me." He didn't explain it. Instead, over the next hour, he cycled through 4 positions: denial, wounded confusion, an appeal to our marriage and Lily, and, finally, when none of those worked, a quiet, barely veiled threat. He said that if I proceeded with the legal filing, things were going to become very difficult, that Harlan had documentation, that there were questions about how Dorothy had acquired the funds in the first place, that a public legal battle would be damaging for everyone, including me. "Including Lily," he added. I looked at him for a long moment after he said that. "I'm going to bed," I said. He called Harlan that night. I could hear the low murmur of his voice through the wall. The next morning, I called Patricia and told her to file step 3. 2 days later, Harlan arrived at Birchwood Lane while I was there alone. He was a tall man, my uncle, with the kind of physical size that he had always used passively. Not threatening exactly, but present in a way that took up room. He told me that he knew about the probate filing. He told me I was making a mistake that I would regret. He said that Grandma Dorothy had not understood what she was doing when she wrote that letter, that she had been confused in her final years, and that the money had always been intended for the family as a whole. "She wrote my name on the envelope," I said. "She was not of sound mind," he said. "Then you'll need to prove that in court," I said. "My attorney is available Monday through Friday." He left. I sat down on the porch steps and allowed myself 3 full minutes of shaking. Then I stopped. Then I called Patricia, and she told me the probate court had confirmed my beneficiary status that morning. I took 4 days off work. I drove to a small inn in Gatlinburg alone, and I walked in the mountains and ate at diners and slept for 9 hours a night. I did not contact Daniel. I did not contact Patricia. I did not read my email. I let myself be still and quiet and completely alone with the version of myself that was emerging from all of this, stronger, clearer, no longer performing anything for anyone. When I drove home on the 5th day, I was ready. The offer came through Jeffrey Crane, delivered in a letter to Patricia's office. Harlan Pruitt, on behalf of himself and unnamed interested parties, proposed a settlement. He would drop his competing claim to the trust. He would sign a release acknowledging my status as sole beneficiary. In exchange, he wanted $12 million, roughly 23% of the total, wired to an account he would designate within 60 days of my depositing the check. He framed it as a family solution, a dignified resolution. Patricia read the letter to me over the phone in a level voice and then said, "It's not legally obligatory, but I want you to hear it before I respond." "Tell them no," I said. "That's what I assumed. I wanted to hear you say it." There was something clarifying about being tempted and feeling nothing. No hesitation, no part of me that wavered and wondered whether 12 million was enough to buy peace. The answer was simply no, and the certainty of it felt like clean air. Daniel's approach was more personal, which I supposed made sense. He was my husband, after all. He knew me better than Harlan did, and he knew that legal threats weren't the lever that would move me. What he tried instead was a version of the life we had built together. On the Saturday after I returned from Gatlinburg, he cooked dinner. Actually cooked. From scratch. The lamb dish he used to make when we were first married. He opened a good bottle of wine. He set the table the way he used to, with the cloth napkins. I ate. I was polite. I answered questions about Gatlinburg. And I watched him try to reconstruct with food and candlelight the version of our marriage that had always been more comfortable for him than for me. The version where I was grateful and he was reasonable and nothing too difficult was ever examined directly. "I'm willing to start over," he said near the end of the meal. "Whatever I did wrong, whatever choices I made that you see as a betrayal, I want to fix it. The money doesn't have to change us." "It already has," I said quietly. "It didn't do it. You did." He looked at me with something I couldn't read, not quite hurt, not quite anger. Something calculated still. "I love you, Caroline." "I know you believe that," I said. And then I went to do the dishes. He stopped pushing after that evening, but I could feel him watching. Both of them, Daniel at home, Harlan, through his attorney's continued correspondence, were in an observation phase, waiting to see whether I would stumble, slow down, or begin to doubt myself. I understood the strategy. I had seen it in my legal work. The side that has less ground to stand on sometimes wins simply by exhausting the other party into settling. I was not going to be exhausted. What I needed was exactly what Patricia had said during our 3rd meeting. You cannot do this alone, and you shouldn't try. Not out of weakness, but because isolation is what they're counting on. I started carefully with Lily. My daughter was 21, a junior at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I drove up on a Tuesday afternoon and took her to lunch. I told her, not everything, not the full legal architecture, but the essential truth, that I had found money that belonged to me, that her father had known about it and had not told me, and that I was in the process of protecting what was rightfully mine. I told her I was sorry to bring this into her life and that I would understand if she needed time. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, why are you apologizing to me for standing up for yourself?" That question undid me briefly. I recovered. I also reached out to two women I had known for years but had allowed to drift, the natural attrition of a marriage that quietly narrowed my world. Margaret Cho, a former colleague who had become a therapist, and Diane Holloway, a woman from my neighborhood who had been through a divorce of her own 5 years earlier and had come out of it, as she once put it, leaner and considerably less tolerant of nonsense. Both of them received my call. Both of them showed up. I began meeting Margaret weekly, not as a patient exactly, more as someone who needed to be seen clearly by another person during a period when the people closest to me had reasons to see me unclearly. Diane accompanied me once to Patricia's office just to sit in the waiting room because she understood, without being told, that having a witness to my own determination helped me maintain it. The support wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a team of allies strategizing on my behalf. It was 3 women, my daughter, a therapist, and a friend, who chose to see me accurately. That was enough. In fact, it was more than I had known in years. They came together, which surprised me. I had not expected Harlan and Daniel to appear in the same room. Their collaboration had always been conducted through layers of separation, through attorneys and phone calls and plausible deniability. But on a Thursday evening in October, Renata knocked on my door, and when I opened it, both men were standing behind her on the porch. Renata was wearing the expression she had perfected over years of family functions, the expression of a reasonable woman come to address an unfortunate misunderstanding. "We just want to talk," she said, "as a family, no lawyers. Just us." I looked at the 3 of them, Renata with her practiced warmth, Daniel with his hands in his jacket pockets, and Harlan standing slightly behind them both, his jaw set, his eyes running calculations. I stepped back and let them in. I will not pretend there was no part of me that hesitated in that doorway, that felt briefly the old pull of accommodation, the trained reflex of a woman who had spent 20 years smoothing things over. But I let them in because I was no longer afraid of what they might say. I had already heard the worst of it, and I had survived it. We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee. Renata spoke first because that was always the arrangement. She was the softening instrument, the one who made the intervention feel like love rather than siege. She talked about family, about the damage that legal battles do, the way they wound people for generations. She talked about Lily and what this was doing to her. She invoked my grandmother's memory, saying that Dorothy would not have wanted her family torn apart over money. "She loved all of us," Renata said. "She would have wanted us to find a solution together." "Dorothy hid the check under a mattress and wrote a warning letter," I said. "That doesn't read to me as someone who wanted a family solution." A small silence. Daniel leaned forward. His approach was different. It was the language of reasonableness and mutual respect that he had always been skillful with, the language that had worked on me for 20 years. He said he understood why I was angry. He acknowledged, and this was new, this was a concession designed to appear as honesty, that he had known about the trust. He said he had kept it from me because he had been trying to protect me from a conflict he knew would be painful, that he had handled it wrongly, but his intentions had been good. I was trying to give us time to figure it out together, he said. You were trying to figure out how to redirect $52 million before I found out it existed, I said. He didn't flinch. That's not what happened, Caroline. Jeffrey Crane, I said. 3 inquiries to First Southern Trust, on Harlan's behalf, documented. Renata shifted on the couch. Harlan cleared his throat. Daniel's expression shifted through something quick and controlled. Surprise, recalculation, the decision to hold his position. I watched him make that decision in real time, watched the muscles of his face arrange themselves back into composure, and I thought, I used to read that composure as strength. Now I saw it for what it was, the practiced mask of a man who had never once stopped calculating, even in the moments I had believed were genuine. Whatever it looks like on paper, he said, it isn't what it looks like. Then what is it? I said. He didn't answer. And in that silence, the entire architecture of the evening collapsed. They had come to talk me out of proceeding, using whatever combination of family sentiment, personal guilt, and appealing reasonableness they could assemble, because they had nothing left. The legal filings were solid. The documentation was in Patricia's hands. There was no argument they could make in my living room that would hold up in a courtroom. Harlan spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and direct. You're going to destroy this family, he said. And for what? For money you didn't earn and don't know how to manage. Dorothy was losing her mind at the end, and someone took advantage of that. And now you're the one holding the bag. Dorothy was sharp until the week she died, I said, and I have 2 physicians who will testify to that. He stood up. You're making an enemy, he said. I already have one, I said. Several, apparently. I'm adjusting. Renata made one final attempt as the 3 of them moved toward the door. She touched my arm, a light, familiar touch, as though we were still the kind of family that touched each other warmly, and she said very quietly, Caroline, think about what you're throwing away. This isn't just about money. This is about who you are to the people who have known you your whole life. I looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked at her face. I know exactly who I am, I said. That's the problem, for all of you. They left. Renata was the last one out, and for just a moment at the door she looked at me, not with her practiced warmth, but with something rawer, something that might have been a flicker of recognition. Then the door closed. I stood in my living room and heard their car pull out of the driveway. And then the fear came, a real physical wave of it, moving through my chest and into my hands. The fear of what comes next from people who have run out of words, people who have stakes that large and feel that cornered, don't simply go home and accept defeat. I knew that. I had seen enough legal disputes to understand what desperation looks like when it has nowhere left to go, and it rarely looks peaceful. But the fear did not weaken me. It sharpened everything, the way cold air sharpens outlines. I took 3 slow breaths, picked up my phone, and called Patricia. They came in person, I said, together. That's a desperation move, she said. I know. What do we do next? We move to discovery, she said. It's time. The discovery process in the probate proceeding took 6 weeks, during which Patricia and Sandra Cho assembled a picture so complete and so damning that when I finally sat in the conference room of the Clarksville courthouse and looked at it laid out on the table, I felt less like I was seeing something new and more like I was seeing, for the first time, the shape of something I had always dimly perceived. The facts were these. Earl Pruitt had established his trust in 1987 with proceeds from the sale of 3 parcels of farmland in Robertson County, land that had been in the Pruitt family since the 1920s. The farmland was sold to a development company for $8.2 million, an enormous sum in 1987. Earl had invested those proceeds through a financial advisor, compounding carefully over decades. By the time Dorothy died 30 years later, the trust had grown to $52 million. Dorothy had known about the trust her entire married life. Earl had told her everything, and Dorothy had known, had watched over the years following Earl's death, that Harlan, her own son, had been making quiet inquiries, positioning himself, hiring a financial attorney to examine the structure of the trust, looking for a mechanism to claim it. She had also known about Daniel. This was the part that required a moment to absorb. Daniel had not met me randomly. The evidence was not conclusive, but it was strongly suggestive. Harlan had been introduced to Daniel Marsh through Jeffrey Crane, who was, at that time, Daniel's attorney for a business matter. Harlan had mentioned in that meeting that he had a niece, an unmarried paralegal in her mid-20s, who stood to inherit a significant trust. He had complained about it, and Jeffrey Crane had apparently seen an opportunity. Whether Daniel had been deliberately positioned to pursue me, or whether the relationship had developed more organically and the knowledge had simply been used, that would never be fully resolved in court. What could be documented was that within 3 months of that meeting, Daniel had contrived to be introduced to me through a mutual professional connection, and that within 1 year of our marriage, he and Harlan had begun making quiet inquiries about the trust. 20 years of my life. The formal hearing was on a Monday morning in November. Patricia had filed for summary judgment on the beneficiary question, which had already been upheld by the probate court. Harlan's competing claim that Dorothy had lacked testamentary capacity had been dismissed 3 weeks earlier when the medical testimony was entered. What remained was a hearing on the redirect attempts, whether Harlan's efforts to claim the funds constituted fraud or merely civil malfeasance. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a gray dress I had bought specifically for this day, and I watched Harlan and his attorney sit down across the room. Daniel was not present. He and I had been separated for 2 months by then, and his own attorney had advised him to stay away from the probate proceedings. Renata was in the gallery, sitting very straight, wearing sunglasses inside, which told me everything I needed to know about how she felt the day was going to go. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Frances Lind, 60-some years old, with the patience of someone who had heard every variety of human self-justification. Harlan's attorney made his argument. It was, I will grant, well constructed. It focused on intent, on family custom, on the ambiguity of Earl Pruitt's original trust language. He was calm and professional, and he made the best case available to him. Then Patricia stood up. She entered into evidence the 3 redirect inquiry letters signed by Jeffrey Crane on Harlan's behalf, the documented meetings between Crane, Harlan, and Daniel predating our marriage, the timeline of Daniel's moves to keep me away from the Birchwood property, Dorothy's letter, authenticated by a handwriting expert and witnessed by the attending physician who had seen her the week it was written, Sandra Cho's forensic accounting report, and finally, a deposition from a former paralegal in Jeffrey Crane's office, a woman who had quit 2 years earlier and who had been, with some careful encouragement, willing to describe the nature of the conversations she had witnessed in that office about the Pruitt Trust. Judge Lind listened. She reviewed the evidence. She asked several questions, pointed and precise, that Harlan's attorney struggled to answer cleanly. and then she looked at Harlan across the courtroom. Not unkindly, but with the frank clarity of someone whose job is to see through the story to the structure beneath it. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "do you have anything to add?" Harlan stood up, and for the first time in my memory of him, the large physical presence that he had always used to fill a room had nowhere to go. He looked diminished. He opened his mouth, and what came out was not an argument or a defense, but a kind of collapsed justification. He talked about how hard his father had worked, how unfair it was that a granddaughter should benefit while sons were passed over, how the money should have gone to people who understood where it came from. Judge Lind let him finish. Then she ruled. Judge Lind's ruling was unambiguous in the way that only the most thoroughly documented cases ever are. She upheld my status as sole beneficiary of the Earl Pruitt Trust. She dismissed Harlan's competing claim in its entirety, finding it unsupported by evidence and, in her words, contradicted by a documented pattern of conduct suggesting bad faith. She referred the matter of the redirect attempt, the 3 inquiries made by Jeffrey Crane on Harlan's behalf, to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential fraud charges. Jeffrey Crane surrendered his law license within the month rather than face the disciplinary board. The deposit of the cashier's check was completed on a Thursday afternoon in December. I sat in a private room at First Southern Trust with Patricia beside me, signed the required documents, and watched a bank officer enter the numbers into a system. $52 million verified, authenticated, and transferred into an account in the name of Caroline Elaine Pruitt. Not Pruitt Marsh, just Pruitt. Patricia and I shook hands in the parking lot. It was a cold, bright day, the kind of Tennessee December afternoon where the light has an unusual clarity, as though the air itself has been cleaned out. I stood next to my car for a moment and looked up at the sky and did not cry, which surprised me. I had expected to. Instead, I felt something quieter, a settling, as though something that had been held at a slight wrong angle for a very long time had finally been set straight. The divorce proceedings were swift, and in the end, less contested than I had feared. Daniel had 2 problems. First, that the $52 million had been established by the court as my separate property, predating and existing outside our marital estate, so he had no legal claim to it. Second, that the documentation of his coordination with Harlan, now part of the public probate record, had made any aggressive divorce posture legally and reputationally untenable for him. His attorney advised him to settle. He did. He received what he was legally entitled to from our marital assets, a fair division of what we had actually built together, which was modest but not nothing, equity in the Sycamore Drive house, half of the joint retirement accounts, his car. He did not receive $1 of the trust. He did not receive the Birchwood Lane property, which I had formally transferred into my own name. We signed the divorce papers on a gray afternoon in February. Daniel looked older than I had ever seen him look. He didn't try to speak to me beyond what the attorneys required. I don't know what I would have said if he had. Harlan's situation was considerably worse. The Attorney General's review resulted in formal charges of attempted financial fraud. Not a misdemeanor, not a civil matter, but a felony charge that carried real consequences. He hired a defense attorney and spent the better part of a year fighting it. In the end, he pleaded to a reduced charge, paid a substantial fine, and received a suspended sentence. The legal fees alone gutted his savings. His marriage, which had always been held together by the projection of a certain prosperity, did not survive the year. Renata stopped returning my calls, which was fine. I had not expected otherwise. What I want to say about the victory, and it was a victory complete and without compromise, is that it did not feel the way I had imagined it would during those early nights of fear and calculation. It did not feel triumphant. It felt like justice, which is a different thing, colder, quieter, more permanent. Triumph is emotional. Justice simply is. I had not set out to destroy anyone. I had set out to claim what was mine, what my grandfather had preserved across decades, and my grandmother had protected with her last conscious act. The destruction that followed for Harlan and for Daniel was the natural consequence of choices they had made over years, and I had simply created the conditions under which those choices could no longer be concealed. I remember the evening after the divorce was finalized. I drove to Birchwood Lane and sat on the porch steps in the February cold, the same steps where I had sat after Harlan left, shaking 6 months before. I brought a thermos of coffee and Scout, my golden retriever, who pressed his warm weight against my legs and watched the yard with me. The house was renovated now. It was beautiful, actually. All the old bones visible and restored, the porch boards solid under my feet. I stayed until the sun went down behind the tree line. Then I went inside. I did not move into the Birchwood Lane house immediately. That surprised some people. Why renovate a house and then not live in it? But the house needed to be a choice, not a refuge, and I needed to make sure I was choosing it for the right reasons. So I rented a small apartment on the east side of Clarksville for 6 months, an intentional in-between space where I had nothing but what I had chosen to keep, and I discovered, with some wonder, that I needed very little. I worked with a financial advisor, a woman recommended by Patricia, one who specialized in inherited wealth and had no connection to any of the previous parties, to build a structure for the money that would serve actual purposes rather than just sitting there being large and abstract. Part of it went into a foundation. I had been a paralegal for 20 years, and one of the things you learn in that work is how many people cannot afford the legal help they need. The Dorothy and Earl Pruitt Foundation funded legal assistance for low-income individuals in probate and family court matters. A specific kind of help, practically targeted, the kind my grandmother would have understood. Part of it funded Lily's future without extravagance. A trust for her education, a down payment held for whenever she was ready, a sense of foundation rather than windfall. Lily handled it with a grace that made me proud in a way I found hard to articulate. She didn't become reckless. She became more herself. I went back to work for another year because I wasn't ready to stop, and because I had always genuinely liked the work. Then I took a leave of absence and spent 3 months in Portugal and then in Italy, alone, not running from anything, but moving toward a version of my own life that I had never been given permission to imagine. I ate well. I read for hours in the afternoons. I walked until my legs ached. I came back to Tennessee tanned and rested and more at peace with silence than I had ever been. I moved into Birchwood Lane on a May morning with Lily's help and Scout's enthusiastic obstruction. We carried boxes through the same door I had walked through that gray Saturday when everything changed. The house smelled like fresh paint and old wood, and something that might have been my grandmother's presence or might have been my own imagination filling a familiar space with what it needed. Margaret, my therapist-turned-friend, brought dinner the first night. Diane brought wine. We sat on the porch and talked for hours and laughed a great deal, and it was the most ordinary, beautiful evening I could remember. I was 45 years old. I owned a restored farmhouse, a foundation with a purpose, a financial structure that would sustain me for the rest of my life, and a self-understanding that had been purchased at considerable cost. I was not bitter. I had thought I might be, but I wasn't. Bitterness requires a belief that things should have been different than they were, and I had come to see that everything, even the loss, even the years of not knowing, had carried me, eventually, to a room in my grandmother's house on a gray Saturday morning. And Harlan. He sold his house in Nashville to cover legal fees and moved into a rental. His professional reputation, he had been a commercial real estate broker, did not recover from the public fraud charges. The industry is a small world. He worked, I heard, in a reduced capacity, doing property management for a company that didn't require its managers to pass a background check. His wife left him in the fall following the charges. I ran into him once, at a gas station off the interstate. He saw me. He looked away first. Daniel relocated to Memphis. I heard through Lily, who heard through channels I didn't ask her to explain, that he had tried to start a consulting business and that it had not gone well. He was living in an apartment. He looked, Lily said, like someone who had stopped maintaining himself. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to, but in the 1,000 small ways that reveal a person who has lost the story they were telling about themselves. I did not feel vindicated by this. I felt mostly nothing, the particular nothing of a chapter that is genuinely over. Renata I did not hear about and did not look for. Some chapters close cleanly. What I felt instead of vindication was something I can only describe as a slow returning to myself, to a life that belonged to me, to the particular quality of morning light through old farmhouse windows that my grandmother had woken up to for 50 years before me. I understood now why she had left it to me, not only because of the trust, not only because of the money, but because she had seen, in me, someone who would need a place to come back to. She had been right. My grandmother hid $52 million under a mattress because she knew that some things must be protected quietly, held close, and passed on carefully. Because not everyone who stands beside you is standing with you. What I learned is this: knowing your worth is not arrogance. Protecting what is yours is not war. And the people who benefit most from your silence will always call your speaking up a betrayal. If you had found that envelope, if your name was on it, what would you have done? I genuinely love to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for listening. Dorothy would have approved.